Good afternoon, passengers. Welcome to Martel Air. My name's Amanda, and I'll be your pilot for today. We're just beginning boarding for flight number 16 from Canberra to Newcastle, so grab your seats while I finished up the last steps of the pre-flight inspections of this Cessna Grand Caravan, the pride of the Martel Air fleet. And we are starting an entire hour behind schedule today because there was just a major update for Microsoft Flight Sim released, and I only gave myself an hour and a half for the updates to download and install, and it turned out to be a 15 gigabyte download, and then my antivirus decided to try to interfere with the installation process because, one of those folders is protected, which caused one of a 4 gigabyte file for the A320 to corrupt and freeze on trying to unzip. So clearly I should have just left the updates to run when I went to bed last night instead of trying to do it while awake today. But let's get on with things. It might be a little bit of a long flight today, depending on how the winds go. But given that last week's 3.5 hour mega stream was the single most popular by about half again of all of my streams so far, based on the recording viewing numbers, it being a bit of a longer flight might not actually be that bad of a factor. Okay, and I have now got updated checklists that I've been working on, so hopefully this will work a little bit better. I love updating checklists. I love checklists. We know this about me. Okay, before engine start checklist. Pre-flight inspection complete. Parking brake handle set. Electrical system switches off. Ignition switch normal. Fuel tank selectors both on. Bleed air heat switch off. Power lever idle. A prop RPM max. Fuel condition lever cut off. And all levers moving properly, so we've not had a USB hub crash this week, which is a nice change. Fuel shut-off knob check. Battery switch on. Cabin lights on. Cockpit lighting set. Flaps up. And no smoking light on. Before engine start checklist complete. The weather today is back to being nice and sunny, although it is quite cold here. At least by my standards. We'll see what the plane's thermometer thinks of things once we get that turned on. And we'll be cruising at an altitude of 8,000 feet, flying over Wollongong and Sydney on our way to Newcastle. Your cabin crew today is myself and Wing Commander Lamington, and your emergency exits are located to the back of the cabin where you entered the plane. I also have a door up here by me, and if you see me leave, please follow me quickly. Our in-flight catering services are provided by our wonderful passengers, so I hope you packed something interesting. Engine start checklist. Battery switch on. Beacon light on. Avionics 1 on. Bus volts check. Emergency power lever normal. Inertial separator bypass. Engine information system readings check. Propeller area clear. Fuel boost switch on. Fuel boost on shown check. Fuel pressure load not shown check. Fuel flow 0 check. Starter switch start. Ignition on shown, check. Oil PSI. Check. NG stable. Fuel condition lever low idle. Fuel flow in expected range, check. NG climbing. NG stable. Starter switch off. EIS readings all normal. Battery amps positive, check. Generator load, check. Generator off, not shown, check. Fuel boost switch normal. Avionics 2 on. Nav lights on. Engine start checklist complete. We're now ready for departure, so please fasten your seatbelts and turn off your devices apart from those used to watch this stream. Thank you for flying Martel Air. We hope you don't die. Before departure taxi checklist. Taxi lights on. Seatbelt lights on. Let's see here, what direction are we actually departing? That is west. Canberra ground, Martel 16 with information Yankee, request taxi for takeoff, west departure. Taxiing, hold short runway 35 via taxiway Kilo, Charlie 4, Charlie, Bravo, November, Martel 16. Taxi clearance, check. And nav source. Set. Prop RPM to minimum. Fuel condition low idle. Inertial separator to bypass. Parking brake off. Before departure, taxi checklist complete. Okay. And we'll just skim past this person here. Oh wow, the mod that I have for Flight Sim to massively reconfigure the taxi markings has been deactivated by the update, quite possibly because it works by rewriting some of the internal code. So for this stream, you'll have to enjoy what the Microsoft Flight Sim default taxiway guide marks are. So in my modified version, these are 10% the size, lower and green to match the taxiway centerline markings, instead of these giant blue physics objects floating in space. This is the joy of a stream that is happening just after an update. I had forgotten just how big these are, and I am reminded of why I modified that. They are certainly a lot more visible than what I usually have it set to, but jinkies. So, after last week's hand fly everything, don't take your hand off the controls adventure, we're back to having some nice actual autopilot functionality at our disposal, which will be a little easier on me. But I will be doing a decent amount of hand flying because, you know, aided along by the caribou getting me to actually focus and do some more of it, you know, discovering that I actually do like the hand flying stuff, because I like actually playing this game instead of just watching it. It's fascinating to have another plane on the taxiway ahead of us, that's fun. Does seem to be running a little bit nicer with the update, which is encouraging. There's meant to be a whole lot of memory optimizations and stutters that have been fixed, which, if that is actually working, that will be glorious, because, especially with the upgraded Canberra airport files, my graphics setup has been stuttering a little on the ground, especially, because that's where you're right up close to all of the details. So, but despite having, you know, a fairly good graphics card, they are taxiing out for takeoff. The giant blue taxi markers are still getting me. Those are ridiculous. But we will hold short here. Okay, before takeoff checklist, parking brake set, altimeter QNH set, standby flight instruments check, fuel boost switch normal, fuel tank selectors both on, fuel quantity check, fuel shut-off knob verify in check. You can't actually see that, it is this knob down here behind where my face usually sits. Standby alt power on. Anti-ice system. Our outside temperature is reading 15, which I don't quite believe. Inertial separator handle normal. Autopilot. Altimeter set to initial cruise 8,000. Check. Flight level change mode engaged. Set to VY. Set heading mode set to runway heading. Set bank mode engaged. Autopilot prepared. Nav source is set. Transponder on alt. Flaps to takeoff position. Takeoff clearance. Canberra Tower, Martel 16, ready at runway 35 for departure to the west. Cleared for takeoff, runway 35, Martel 16. Takeoff clearance check. Strobe lights on, landing lights on, seatbelt lights on, parking brake release, fuel condition high idle, prop RPM to max. Before takeoff checklist complete. Power gently. Rotate, and we are in the air. Runway heading and climb. Canberra Tower, Martel 16, continue for west departure. And flaps up. Climb speed as we are round towards our nav path. As we approach 2000 on the radar altimeter, we're climbing quite briskly, but so is the ground. But 2000 feet above terrain, we will switch on the autopilot. Okay. Cruise climb checklist. Anti-ice system will be required going to 125.9er Martel 16. Canberra approach, Martel 16 is type Cessna Caravan, 4 miles northeast of Canberra, 4,900 feet. Request clearance to transition Charlie airspace. Squawk 2301 Martel 16. Cleared through the Charlie airspace, Martel 16. Okay. Cruise climb checklist. Anti-ice system will be required, so pitot-static heat on, stall heat on. Inertial separator handle normal. Airspeed is VY. Prop RPM to somewhere in the 1600 to 1900 range. Power lever set to keep ITT below 825. Check. Okay, cruise line checklist complete. So we are back in the air with actual decent flying weather. But unlike the Australian summer flying weather that we had for most of the early streams, we've actually got some interesting stuff in the sky. There are clouds around. What luxury! here we have Lake George being displayed fully as a lake, as it always does in Flight Sim, which is, I mean, a little more realistic this time of year than sometimes, but that is a sheep paddock and cow pasture. Anything else is just propaganda. You can't go sailing on Lake George because there's so many cattle fences that never get more than about a metre below the water that any boat you try and put on there will just rip its hull apart on farm fencing. And we're coming up on our cruise altitude. I don't know if you've heard my rants about Lake George, but it's essentially a floodplain that... Oh, so Lake George is a floodplain that is usually... like, it spends at least half its life not flooded. So there's just fences all the way through it, like any other farming environment. It's just that sometimes it's a lake. So the people who put their cows there, so it's slightly deeper to the south where we are versus the north. So essentially when it floods from this end to that end. Yes, a field that is sometimes a lake. Excellently put. It's also called an occasional lake. It's very Australian. I have not investigated the existence of cow mermaids in Lake George. That might be classified. It might be... yeah, the lake that we put out when guests are coming over. I guess that's why it's always completely laked in Flight Sim, because this is when we're showing off. Yes, it's a black tie cow maid event. I have friends who I need to ask to draw this. It delights me so. And it is also being usually a field and... one second. Checklist. Cruise checklist. Seatbelt lights off. Anti-ice system remaining on. Inertial separator handle is normal. Power lever to 87%. Prop RPM to 1750. Fuel balance check. ITT very much in the safe range. Checklists. Cruise checklist complete. I was in the middle of a rant. Oh yes, so Lake George was one of the alternative proposed sites for Canberra, because it is such excellent flat land here that we've got, you know, you wouldn't even need to clear too much off, you just need to put in some really good drainage. But, you know, and, you know, outside of Lake George you can see the bits that aren't quite low and flat enough over here to count as lake. Those would also just get built out onto. But yeah, originally they were going to try and, I don't know if it was just completely Venice us, but yeah, that was one of the original notions for where to put Canberra. I'm glad they didn't do that. Going to 133.15, Martel 16, goodbye. Melbourne Centre, Martel 16 at 8,000 feet. But yeah, so instead of that cow and sheep field, they took a related nearby cow and sheep field instead. There is a long-running joke and historical quote of Canberra is a good sheep paddock ruined, which just amuses me. It's so ridiculous and slightly petty. I love it. So many interesting knobs and dials around here. Cabin heat firewall shut off. Aha. Interesting. And as it is 2 degrees outside, I think we'll get the cabin heating set on. So, bleed air heat switch on. And temperature... Does the temperature knob work? No. Let's put the fans in the back up a bit more. Just get the plane a little bit warmer down the back. And it is looking like, with the current fairly calm winds and mild tailwind that we've got, we're managing 147 knots across the ground, and looks like it'll be about an hour 15 to Newcastle. Going to 118.8, Martel 16, goodbye. Melbourne Centre, Martel 16, 8,000 feet. The joys of flying into the areas with repeated changes of flight control area. There's a couple of spots where if you pick just the wrong flight path, you'll have like a 30-second clip through the airspace of one before you switch into a third, which is just wild. But it is nice to be back to the slightly more normal type of stream. The long caribou stream was a lot of fun, and I will be doing those occasionally. I probably won't insist on flying the caravan back to Canberra before each one of those, just because that will make the caravan flights a lot more limited in where I can put them. And I'm actually considering whether I want this flight to be the first on the circumnavigation of the Australian coast, which would have us going anti-clockwise instead of clockwise, but that gets us away from the familiar southeast coast quicker than holding it, you know, starting off with all of the familiar stomping grounds. We can save those for a nice familiar site on our way back. And yes, one of the features of the new checklist that I've worked out is I went through and worked out the best engine settings for a good cruising speed that also manages a good amount of fuel economy, which you might have seen on the Caribou I have huge charts for, but being a turboprop with a lot more automation, it's a little bit simpler in the Caravan than the Caribou. So we are flying out to the town/city of Wollongong, which is on the coast south of Sydney, and then we'll be following the coast up over Sydney itself, and then over we're passing by Gosford and then hitting Newcastle, which is a lot like Wollongong, but north instead of south along the coast. Hopefully that cough was not too deafening. I need to work out where I keep the mute button, to be quite honest. But I think that should have been the mute button, not just... It's actually the visibility button for the microphone feed. Anyway. So, one of the things that I have not managed in a little while is some of the poetry stuff. And one of the things that I've been pondering is there's also some songs that basically count, like, so the one I am particularly thinking of for this week is Waltzing Matilda. I will not be singing it, I will be talking through it more than anything. But, because Waltzing Matilda is one of those songs that is kind of iconic of Australia, but often completely misunderstood, not understood. So, yeah, it's got a lot of local language and also late 19th century local language, which is an interesting combination for getting things understood. Sorry, words just froze there. So yes, I will be... Look, I am going to struggle to read these lyrics without doing at least some of the tune. So, but I am not a singer, and so, you know, do not expect wonders in that department. And after each verse, I'm going to explain what it actually means. So yes, Waltzing Matilda, which, as so many of the poems that I've done, is by Banjo Paterson. I'm assuming you've at least heard of Waltzing Matilda. It is one of the tunes that gets played in media to say this is Australia, the way that various Edith Piaf songs get played on accordion to explain that this scene is happening in France. Going to 118 decimal, no, not, go to 129.8 Martel 16. Melbourne Centre, Martel 16, 13 miles southeast of Goulburn, 8,000 feet. Squawk 1531, Martel 16. Okay. So. And of course I am having to juggle windows while I do this. Doing, like, all of the gaming stuff has never made me want to get a third monitor, but streaming, while I've got, you know, OBS plus text plus flight sim, that's got me started thinking about a third monitor. Anyway, Waltzing Matilda. Once a jolly swagman camped by the billabong, under the shade of a coolabah tree, and he sang as he watched and waited till his billy boiled. Oh, come a waltzing Matilda with me. Okay, as we see, me doing the tune is not really working today. But, so, yes, Swagman. So the Jolly Swagman of this is a homeless itinerant worker who has all of his belongings in a bag that might also function as a sleeping bag. But yes, so yes. Guy, down on his luck, wandering around from one job to another as he can find them, currently camping out by a billabong, which is an oxbow cut-off lake. When a river wiggles too much and it cuts off one of the wiggles to find a shortcut, you get a little lake left behind. The technical term is oxbow cut-off lake. The Australian Aboriginal derived word is billabong. And given that this is, Southeast Australia, probably Victoria, it's surrounded by gum trees of various kinds. One species of which is a coolabah tree. And he's saying as he watched and waited till his billy boiled. A billy is a cheap metal can with a lid that you put over the fire to boil water in. Yes, Waltzing Matilda is... There's a few theories, but essentially it's... carrying his swag around and, he's just pining for company on his wanderings. That's what "Will come a waltzing Matilda with me" means. Along came a jumbuck to drink at the billabong. Up jumped the swagman and grabbed him with glee. And he sang as he stowed that jumbuck in his tucker bag. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. So, a jumbuck is a male sheep, but again, Australian Aboriginal derived word for it. The original word is nothing like jumbuck, but that's how white people stealing words and just kind of adopting them goes. And a tucker bag. To work out what a tucker bag is, you need to know that tucker means food. Often found in, at least in English, British English, I've heard like bush tucker trials. So yes, the tucker bag is much like the tucker box that the dog sat on. So yes, the tucker bag. Bag for tucker. Food. Also, related to tucker is that the school canteen / place that will sell you kind of low-grade food at school, often just called the tuck shop, which has some interesting implications if you're used to other sections of slang. But anyway. Also, I'm skipping the chorus just because that is repetitive, and since I'm not really singing it, it won't quite fit. Anyway. Up rode the squatter, mounted on his thoroughbred. Down came the troopers, 1, 2, 3. And who's that jolly jumbuck that you've got in your tucker bag? You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. So, the squatter. In most English uses, the squatter is somebody low grade, like low class, who's squatting on land that isn't theirs. Going to 123.5 Martel 16. Goodbye. And of course, I get interrupted in this by more ATC calls. Now approach Martel 16, 8,000 feet. So yes, in 19th century Australian usage, squatter is essentially a form of local aristocracy. And it comes from exactly the same meaning of somebody who is squatting on land that is not actually theirs. Basically how this worked is that the initial land rush during colonisation, the people who got there first and just claimed huge swaths of land for their own farms, cattle stations, etc., set themselves up as the local landowning aristocracy, and people just kind of had to roll with it. So instead of squatting in somebody else's house, it's squatting on what could have been thousands of, or hundreds of people's worth of farmland. Which is why the squatter is mounted on his thoroughbred and is accompanied by troopers 1, 2, 3. And oh dear, our hungry homeless guy is now they're attempting to arrest him for sheep theft, which, kinda a bit of a fate there. Up jumped the swagman and leapt into the billabong. "You'll never catch me alive," said he, "and his ghost may be heard as you pass by the billabong. Come a waltzing Matilda with me." I don't think I actually need to explain any extra terminology in that last verse. So, yeah, the most famous Australian song, in a lot of cases, and one that was seriously proposed as our national anthem by some weird people, is about a homeless guy who grabs a sheep to feed himself on the road. The local illegal, but we can do nothing about it, landowner tries to arrest him for it, and he jumps into a lake to commit suicide. When there was the quest to find a national anthem for Australia, when we were trying to move on from God Save the whichever monarch it is at the moment, I'm just gonna double check the dates on that. So the voting on this was in 1977. And so Waltzing Matilda was one of the 4 options on the referendum. And it came in second with 28% of the vote. Song about a suiciding sheep thief. Nearly our national anthem. So yes, first place was Advance Australia Fair, which has a whole bunch of stuff going on with it. Second place, Waltzing Matilda, so 43% to Advance Australia Fair, 28% to Waltzing Matilda, 18% to God Save the Queen, as in, let's just not change, and 9% to The Song of Australia, which is the one that has basically completely disappeared from any usage, which is just, it's the one that seems slightly more anthem-like. So you know that Australia is still part of the British Commonwealth. We are under the Queen. And given that the British Parliament retained the right to pass laws about Australia until the Australia Act of 1986, and the Australia Act 1986 is a joint act of the British and Australian Parliaments. Look, there was an Australian Republican movement around the year 2000, because, you know, ooh, symbolic, plus we've got the Olympics. It was an absolute debacle. There's still a lot of hurt feelings 20-something years later. Partially it failed because the proposed changes were written badly, and the system proposed was a little too American. And also, Elizabeth II was quite popular, and honestly still is. Her son, King Prince Charles, which I insist is his full name. He was Prince Charles for so long that is just his name. It's not a title. He is King Prince Charles. So, you know, if there was talk about holding a new referendum once Chucky takes the throne. But we'll see where that goes. We've got so many other fascinating issues to deal with. My throat is sounding weird today. Hopefully that helps a little bit. One thing I love about getting the berry flavour of the energy drink that I have is it's basically on-brand colour. Oh, American anthems. I have such fun facts about the American anthems. I'm not too familiar with America the Beautiful. I'm just looking that one up. Oh, it's the Amber Waves one, which is actually the one with more of its own tune. And yes, To Anacreon in Heaven is in fact the source of the US current and national anthem, which is not quite a drinking song, but it is the club song of what was essentially a drinking club. But, you know, one of those intellectual clubs that just happens to meet in a bar. Going to 1290.8 Martel 16. Goodbye. Melbourne Centre, Martel 16, 8,000 feet. Now, the American patriotic song whose tune amuses me the most is My Country 'Tis of Thee. That one is utterly hilarious. Okay, apparently the official title for that one is America, but it is known by its first line because that is such a dreadfully generic title. But yes, My Country 'Tis of Thee. We've talked about a song that was already using that tune. And one of my favourite games for screwing with people's heads is to switch around the lyrics between My Country 'Tis of Thee and what it stole the tune of. And yeah, it's... So let me just actually get the lyrics up. My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, God save the King. Yeah, My country, 'tis of thee is to the tune of God Save the King / God Save the Queen. It is weird that we have to call it God Save the King again because we've switched back. Like, the song is God Save the Queen. I can't believe they appointed a guy to be the new Queen. That is just political correctness gone mad. But yeah, one of the American patriotic songs that is so popular is to the British National Anthem. So, and yeah, like, it has to be God Save the Queen because that's what shows up in all of the punk songs from the 60s and 70s. Although technically, if it's God Save the Queen now, you're singing in favour of Camilla. Is that better or worse than singing in favour of Chucky? My opinions on the actual monarchy and all of the associated stuff, and my feelings on patriotism are all fascinating and complicated, and let's just go with wild. I shan't get too political on the stream other than to mock King Prince Charles, because that's just what one does. Like, for all that one can say about the British monarchy, they haven't given us Trump. And, you know, I don't think it's any spoilers on the political sidings for me to say mean things about Trump, given that I have 3 pride flags painted on the side of this plane and everything else about me as well. And honestly, the monarchy don't actually cause that much trouble. Is there anything mean to say about the ill-fitting suit-wearing, unspeakable act-endorsing orange pile of shit that hasn't been said 100 times? Given that I'm trying to not swear too much on these streams, pretty clouds. And here we've got some of the lakes that show up in Australia, where you've got the lovely crinkly bits that just kind of fill in with water. And then crinkly bit, crinkly bit, crinkly bit, ocean. And on Trump being a swear word, given that Trump has meant fart for a lot longer than he's been famous, oh yes, we're coming into some wonderfully crinkly bits as we come up past Sydney. The road from Canberra to Sydney has some wonderful, like, getting into actual gorges and everything that, because I'm always the one driving, I never manage to get photos of. But there's some wonderful crinkly bits around Sydney. Like, I don't care for Sydney itself too much, just because it has 20% of the Australian population. But the landscape's lovely. So yes, we are coming out onto the coast and over Nowra, Kiama, Wollongong sort of area. Yeah, so that is the city of Wollongong itself. This is all the sort of places where you get, you know, good ports, so you get industrial sort of towns building up. Because, you know, where you've got the ports, you put the industry for what's going on to the ships or coming off the ships, put that as near to the port as possible, and you save yourself a bit of money. But actually, I'm not sure if I've been to Wollongong proper. If we do continue the course north along the coast over the next few flights, we're going to be completely leaving the areas that I have ever been to fairly rapidly. Like, I've been to Queensland once, but that is one of the interesting things about flying this all over the place, is that we actually go places that I've not been. Got up to a 9-knot tailwind now. That is nice. Which means that from our half tanks of fuel when we took off, we've still got 2 hours 20 something of endurance left. And yes, one of the reasons that I'm specifically doing my flights around Australia and treating Canberra as a home base is that I get to show off all of these places that, you know, a lot of people have never been, and especially the ones that don't get as much attention in international media. Going to 124.4, Martel 16, goodbye. Sydney approach, Martel 16, 8,000 feet. So we are officially into the Sydney approach control. And we will be flying mostly directly over, or nearly over, Sydney Airport, which will be an interesting one. We'll see if they tell us to go around. May have to double check the maps on that, but as we'll be holding 8,000 feet and the airport itself is down at Lake Zero, because Sydney Airport juts out into the ocean, which makes some of the approaches fascinating as you just come in over the water, over the water, over the water, beach runway. And yes, lovely view of the crinkly bits and the fluffy bits. And we're flying directly at that extra fluffy section. That might be fun. But yes, showing off the bits of Australia that don't get the media attention because they're unimportant and much like all of the other bits. But it's a lot of fun. Oh, some of these areas would be beautiful to fly over at night when you start getting the city lights going. I may have to do some nighttime streams that are, you know, actual nighttime, because, you know, when I've got it set to live weather, whatever time it is here is basically what time it is for the sim. So, I think it was stream number 2 or 3 where it was Canberra to Goulburn, utterly dreadful weather, pitch black. So, trying not to do those where it will have to be internal to the plane and my own sparkling personality only. And the other thing about those nighttime streams will be what time it ends up being for everybody else. I'm now picturing doing a midnight takeoff in the Caribou from Canberra to do a, midnight cargo run somewhere. That would be an interesting one. If I ever get really bad insomnia, there might just be an unexpected midweek midnight stream. And for time reference, it is currently 2 p.m. for me. So whatever time is 10 hours from now for you would be what a midnight stream would be like for me. And yeah, that would have to be when I am utterly consumed by insomnia and just need to do something to use up the energy. We'll see how that goes. But if that's something that'd be interested in, then, certainly something I can play around with. I might get us up to 10,000 feet. I'm just not liking the look of that. Let's drop that down to 110 and pull that back up on power. Just a little bit of looking at the weather directly ahead and saying, no thank you. And we definitely want to keep the anti-ice system switched on for this. Breakfast entertainment instead of dinner theatre. That doesn't sound too bad in all honesty. Okay, so the weather is not actually showing anything on the weather radar from that giant cluster ahead of us, but I still think that 10,000 feet will be nicer than taking it dead center of the cloud. Going to 129.8, Martel 16, goodbye. Melbourne Centre, Martel 16, 9,600 feet, climbing to 10,000. And as we come to our new cruise altitude... Oh, you're bouncing me between frequencies, of course you are. Going to 124.4, Martel 16. And we will set our cruise settings. Sydney approach, Martel 16, back on frequency 10,000 feet. Now, an interesting thing is the fact that in Australia, so in aviation, are we using flight level or are we using thousands of feet? Where flight level is a number of hundreds of feet with a standardized pressure setting. Whereas altitude in thousands of feet, you use the actual local air pressure to get your altitude. So in Flight Sim, because in America, the transition between the two is at 18,000 feet, which is actually flight level 180. In Australia, that transition's at 10,000, so we're sitting exactly on that line, which is kind of interesting. But Flight Sim doesn't actually model that. In Europe it's even more complicated. It varies by country and sometimes by airport, which is just wild. But yes, US-wide it is 18,000, Australia it's 10,000, but Flight Sim it's 18. And we've got about half an hour left until we get to Newcastle, and we can just start to see Sydney. Now there are several large bays around here, but we shall see what we can see out of these windows. So yes, the next one along, I believe, is Sydney Harbour. You can see, small kind of boring bridge there, and then so there we have Sydney Airport, and beyond it we have Sydney CBD, Central Business District, downtown in America. I can see a few other planes' lights out in the cloud, which is why we have these why we have such bright lights on the planes. And I just realised that I never actually turned the landing lights off. But as we're now coming into a traffic area, I'll be leaving them on just for the moment. I got distracted during my takeoff into cruise climb checklist. Possibly that the landing lights off should be in the cruise climb checklist, not the takeoff checklist. And we Commander Lamington, happy away, sitting away, watching everything tick by. As always, his company is very important. And we've got golf courses and lakes and far too many people's houses. I don't actually know if that little flashy white light just above Sydney Centre is visible on the stream. It is a single pixel on my screen. But one of the things about Sydney Centre itself is that, see, that's the sort of bits of Australia that actually make it into international media. Might actually bump us onto edit mode. And just swing us out over the coast a little bit so that we can get a bit of a better view of Sydney on our way past, because might as well look at the pretty landmarks. And there are the main two that you probably know about. We have the Sydney Harbour Bridge and the Sydney Opera House that are really that close together, because that's the centre of Sydney, and that's where they put the things. Going to 129.8 Martel 16. Goodbye. Really? Going to 124.4 Martel 16. Fuck off. love it when it kicks me between ATC channels. Sydney approach, Martel 16 back on channel. Little ATC region glitches. What fun, what fun. And now it's disappeared behind a cloud. Let's get to 8,000 again. That. Get you a nice view while we're doing touristy things. Yeah, let's call it 7,000. So scenic. Of course you can see 4 feet. There they are. There we go. It says we've got centre of Sydney, Opera House, Harbour Bridge, and various other things. And one of the Sydney Harbour ferries, which are always popular. There's a lot of famous beaches around this area, you know, very popular, especially because Sydney is far too crowded. I don't actually know Sydney geography that well, having never lived there and not really wanting to. Because, as I've said, Sydney has about 20% of the Australian population. It's about 21%, with Melbourne having about 19%. Australia is really urbanised because the middle of it is really nothing. Sydney has Sydney doesn't so much end as fade out, and sometimes you can't tell where Sydney stops and one of the satellite towns begins. So, you know, and we had Wollongong on the way in, and we've got Gosford on the way out to the north, and a few other towns that I can't remember the names of because it's all just kind of that blurry mass of Sydney to me. But yeah, it's one of those things where it just kind of fades in as you drive along, and by the time you start seeing things on the side of the road that might be the start of Sydney, you might have another hour to go before you get into Sydney. And yes, definitely metropolitan area. It's just endless suburbs. I have been told good things about the Sydney public transport system between the trains and the buses, because Sydney would be unlivable without it. Canberra has worse public transport that is gradually kind of improving. But yes, but then again, you can cross Canberra in half an hour. You can't cross Sydney in 3. Just double checking. So yeah, Sydney has 5.5 million people in it, which is just too many. But one of the things about 40% of Australians living in either Sydney or Melbourne is that if you meet a random Australian and you guess them to have come from either Sydney or Melbourne, you've got pretty good odds. If you get the wrong one between those two, they might get offended because, you know, city rivalries, always get those. If they're too intense about their coffee, they're from Melbourne. Part of the reason for Melbourne having the coffee culture is that it is one of the places that got very heavily Greek and Italian migration after World War II. To the point that Melbourne at one point I think had the largest Greek population after Athens. So that rather set what the coffee culture would be like, and is something that was directly credited with the fact that Starbucks Australia completely failed and left. We had Starbucks and then it died out. I think there's like 2 places that have Starbucks left, mostly in the airport. Basically because the whole business model of Starbucks being, you know, the third destination being established as, you know, add in the concept of having this coffee place that's going to be good coffee and you can have it anywhere and all these other things that they say in Starbucks marketing. Australia just already had that, but with better coffee. And also normal serving sizes with the names correct. Do you know that everywhere but Starbucks, a tall is the name for a large coffee? Not the smallest? Wow, I've apparently got 55 hours engine on time in the Caravan, according to that little clicky gauge. That's a fun one. It's interesting seeing how the flight time just slowly ticks up, especially now that I'm doing, you know, 1 hour something flights for streams. I think my dad has over 1,000 hours in flight sim so far, but he does quite a bit of flight sim time as a it's a lovely mindfulness sort of thing, which is actually one of the things I love about it. Like, this is me doing mindfulness while rambling, which is an interesting combination, I must admit. Yeah, being retired and able to invest in a fun setup means that he is able to tick up the flight hours quite nicely. And, you know, being former actual pilot means that he is the inspiration for me doing this so sensibly and seriously. Like, I could be doing the bush pilot and acrobatic things and all sorts of silly things and flying military jets and all this, but no, just nice flights, sensible, chill, chatty. Probably not usually as long as last week's. 3.5 hours of rambling to Canberra did basically use up at least a week's worth of words. I don't usually talk that much, but you know, something about 2 cans of energy drink and a fresh dose of ADHD meds and having the camera on got me ramble, chat for 3.5 hours. And yeah, so the end of last stream, the only bit of post-stream cleanup, like, you know, sorting out all of the computer settings and returning everything to normal and shutting down, the only stuff I got done before running quickly to the bathroom was the end broadcast button. Everything after that got to wait. Because, yeah. I am glad that you enjoyed the flight south that you managed to get to. The takeoff just after you had to disappear was exciting. You know, 17 knot crosswind, and now the plane was a lot lighter and I was trying to take off. Because the thing about flying in a crosswind is when you're in the air, it doesn't actually matter. You just kind of point your plane in the direction that makes you travel in the right way, even if you have to point slightly away from the direction you're going. Going to 133.8, Martel 16, goodbye. Martel, Melbourne Centre, Martel 16, 7,000 feet. So yes, flying in a crosswind when you're flying is absolutely fine. You don't need to worry about, oh, but my plane isn't pointing the direction it's going. When you're actually trying to navigate relative to the ground, the numbers I keep saying are the next radio frequency that I've been told to go to. And my call sign, Martel 16 in this case. Well, the 16 is flight number, just because I don't actually need a flight number. I could just be doing it on Victor Hotel Alpha Mike Juliet, but you know, it's more fun to make it flight number, which is also stream number. But yeah, so when I say a number like 133.8, that is, so the air traffic control regions have a different frequency that they communicate on each, just so that this frequency is only for planes in this general area being kept track of by this specific controller. And when you get given a frequency to change to, you read it back to just so that they can double check you. Like, there's a lot of things where you read back the thing you've been given, so not just so that you know it, but so that they know you didn't mishear. There have been air crashes from somebody getting the air pressure number wrong, like just swapping 2 digits, which meant that their altimeter was wrong on landing. So yes, there's a lot of read back and confirm. We're getting out into the Newcastle. Oh, not quite into Newcastle. That is Gosford down there. Just glancing over at my map. And yes, the the way that things are said, or the radio telephony phraseology, is all very, very specified. Essentially, from every time there's an accident or an incident that could have been prevented by improving communication, they take the improvement that would have fixed it, make it part of the rules. And the first one of these was just the invention of air traffic control. And, the introduction of the radar tracking. But yeah, so all of these little, you do this in exactly this way, are... We've learned that getting this bit wrong, or having a misunderstanding of this, or this, might have bad effects, so we just have a standard way to say everything that makes it so that everybody is expecting the same phrasing. Which also helps with if you're travelling internationally and, for example, thicker accents or local slang, all that sort of thing. And yes, safety regulations are written in blood, which is one of the things I hold to my heart. And essentially, if you watch any of the air crash investigation sort of shows, which there are many, my favourite at the moment is a YouTube channel called Disaster Breakdown, you get the what we learned from this accident, and every one of those ends up, with some rare exceptions, but every one of those ends up making flying safer, because we work out why it happened and then make it so that doesn't happen. Yeah, so you get standard things like, if you're saying the number 9, you say niner, and if you've got a decimal point in something, you say decimal instead of point or dot or something else. It's also where the phonetic, it's not the NATO phonetic alphabet, but it is related. It's the ICAO phonetic alphabet, but the, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, etc. That is because, if you've had to give an order code at a drive-through, you can see why the phonetic alphabet happens, because is that B, D, C, G, E? Too many letters that sound identical. Going to 125.7, Martel 16. Brisbane Centre, Martel 16, 7,000 feet. And as I cross over into that new air traffic control area, you might have noticed that that was Brisbane Centre, not Melbourne Centre. There are two air traffic control centres for, outside of airport specific stuff, there are two for all of Australia, Melbourne and Brisbane. There used to be one in Perth and there used to be one in Sydney, but they got consolidated. So Melbourne covers all the way out to Perth, and Melbourne and Brisbane, so Melbourne covers Sydney and Brisbane covers down to just north of Sydney. And Brisbane covers a decent amount out into the Pacific. So how I'm being told the new frequency. So one of the things that I have turned off is the sound for the air traffic control channel, because, in the roleplay of this stream, that's just coming into my headset. But essentially, one of the things I have on my second monitor is the text feed of the communications to and from air traffic control. So They are saying, you're leaving my airspace, go to this frequency. So I go to that frequency. And yes, so all the way out to Perth. So the air traffic control, essentially big fancy office block, because that's just built in Melbourne, and one of the things that you get is that because it's not the air traffic control for a runway, it's just airspace air traffic control. They just need the radar data feed, and transferring that from the radars spaced around Western Australia, feeding it to an office in Melbourne is not that much more delay than feeding it to an office in Perth. And consolidating down to 2 has just been, what they've determined to be the most economical way to do things. Now then, the Newcastle airport that we are coming in towards is actually labelled as Williamtown, which is basically, there's a few places around Australia that are combination civilian airport and Royal Australian Air Force Base. And some of those are known by the name of the civilian airport, and some of them are known by the name of the military base. So we took off from Canberra Civilian Airport, which shares a runway and some facilities with the RAF Fairburn base. And we are coming in to Newcastle Airport, which shares runway and some facilities with RAF Williamtown. I don't know who William is, but he has a town and an a town and an airbase. Okay, let's find. Williamtown Tower, Martel 16 is 23 miles southwest, 7,000 feet, with information Yankee to land. Enter left downwind, runway 12, Martel 16. Okay. Let's drop down to 445. And I think I'll do this as another hand-flown general aviation sort of landing rather than doing all of the autopilot stuff. Okay. Approach checklist. Seatbelt lights on. Fuel tank selectors both on. Fuel condition high idle. Prop RPM to max, and we will leave flaps until we are in the pattern. Landing lights are on. Attention passengers, we're now approaching Newcastle, and I've switched on the seatbelt lights, which means I'd like you to fasten your seatbelts. Enjoy this riddle and more as we come in towards landing, and thank you again for flying Martel Air. We hope you don't die. Okay. And Williamtown is... what's the elevation here? Runway 12, elevation 29 feet. it is always wild to come into these coastal airports where they're, you know, a couple of stories within sea level. But that means that our altitude is going to be shifting to 1,500 feet as we get close. So I'll set up for that. And this is definitely one of those things where I love being just so procedural and sensible. It's just fun for me. So one of the things I have up on my second screen, other than the air traffic control and the streaming software, is some of the actual airport charts, aerodrome charts for Williamtown Airbase. So I can pull up the actual details and look at those and have some fun with the actual stuff. There are services that will give you the flight sim approved versions of all of these, like Navigraph, if you pay a fee. I don't want to pay that fee, and since I'm flying in Australia, I could just pull the official ones from Air Services Australia. They're available online as PDFs for free, which is a wild little situation. And you get to look at such interesting things as, as I land to the left/north of the runway is RAF Williamtown, and to the south/right of the runway will be the much smaller civilian terminal. And at each end there are alert aprons, which doesn't actually explain what those are for, but I'm pretty sure they're for the planes that might need to. I'm pretty sure it's where you park the fighter planes that might need to be taking off soon. And yes, I think the NOAA data is actually what a lot of flight sim stuff is based on as well. It's certainly what little nav map pulls in when I use it to check the nav data, which is fun. For Australian stuff, it should really be the Bureau of Meteorology, but it is what it is. Lovely industrial dockyard sort of infrastructure down here. I love infrastructure. I'm not sure what this stuff is. It's honestly could be train yards. I think there's a decent amount of mining stuff that gets delivered here for wrong button, for export stuff, but I'm not entirely sure what that bit was. But let's take it down to I think it's train yards, possibly coal for going onto cargo ships. Coal and iron ore are two of Australia's big exports, mostly to China. Although a lot of the iron ore is out of Perth and related regions. Okay, let's get that descent happening. And yes, interpreting the bird's eye view of things, I mean, it's especially interesting for me when I'm trying to fly navigating around Canberra, which I know all of these navigational things I'm looking for from ground level, but from a plane, it gets complicated. Because you have to try and picture the externals of what you're usually looking at and piece together like 5 different views into a map. It's kind of wild. And there, in fact, is the base. So, approach checklist. Seatbelt lights on. Fuel tank selectors both on. Fuel condition high idle. Prop RPM to max. Flaps to approach position. Landing lights on. Inertial separator to bypass. No, we're not diving that quickly, thank you, autopilot. The autopilot was trying to maintain a particular airspeed, and then I changed the engine settings. This is why we pay attention. But we are now setting up for entering that left downwind as instructed. Cleared to land after traffic on final runway 12, Martel 16. Can I see the aircraft that's on final? Yes, we are amongst your people. Such trees. We will not be meeting them too closely, I hope. We are not planning on meeting them too closely. That is just entirely a bad plan. And I'm going to hand fly from here. Yes, land first, depart plane, meet trees. Plane not meet trees other than passenger trees. Passenger trees are wonderful and loved, but external trees at speed? No. Okay, final checklist. Seatbelt light on, flaps to a landing position. Mechanic trees. That's an interesting notion. Okay. And we are lined up on the runway. Lovely. Some somewhat of a short final, but we are in a general aviation sort of bus. Not crosswind, which is a little bit, but not too much to worry about. Little fast.
500.
Probably a little high, but we've got plenty of runway. Ah yes, it's the military type of approach lighting, which means I need to line up the little dots. And one good thing about all of those trees around the airport is they are a lovely windbreak as you get down to ground level. Oh, and that is a displaced threshold that's not entirely marked. That does have touchdown markings inside it. So we're not going to touch down inside that displaced threshold. We're going to test my accuracy and land on the actual marked runway. Over here. Flaps up. And anti-ice off. And standby alt power off. And here's our turn. And we are turning south because we are going to the civilian side. Going to 127.25 Martel or 16. Goodbye. And we are clear of the runway. Okay, before arrival taxi checklist. Taxi lights on, strobe light off, landing lights off, seatbelt lights on, taxi clearance. Taxiing to Williamtown ground, Martel 16 request taxi to parking. Taxiing to general aviation parking via taxiway, Martel 16. Guess they don't. Oh, this has a very simple taxiway. We just need the clearance, not the directions. Okay, inertial separator is bypass, prop RPM to minimum, fuel condition low idle, and parking brake off. Before arrival taxi checklist complete. Attention passengers, we've landed safely in Newcastle, Williamtown, and the local time is 2:50 p.m. Please remain seated until the plane comes to a complete stop at whatever ridiculous parking spot they give us, because queuing for the exit in an 8-seater makes you look even more ridiculous than normal. I really need to retune the taxiway indicators on this. I am so missing the updated version that I installed that has disappeared with the update. I miss my 10% size little green markings. And this box being painted white and mounted at ground level so that it looks like painted markings. So yes, if you're curious what the Flight Sim default taxiway markings look like. It's this mess. And a suicidal ground tech. Okay. Shutdown checklist. Parking brake handle set. Power lever idle. Bleed air heat switch off. ITT range is stable. Prop RPM to feather. Fuel condition cut. Inertial separator handle to normal. External lights off. Seatbelt light off. Attention passengers, this now concludes our flight from Canberra to Newcastle, and we here at Martel Air hope you've enjoyed your time in our tiny sky bus. Please wait until I've opened the door, and you can calmly deplane in an orderly fashion. Our baggage handling services today will be provided by our wonderful passengers, so thank you for not leaving any of your luggage behind. Any personal belongings left behind as you leave the plane will be assumed to be a present to the pilot and co-pilot, and enjoyed thoroughly. Thank you for flying Martel Air. We hope you don't die. Cabin lighting off. Fuel boost switch off. And G is stopped. Avionics 2 off. Avionics 1 off. Battery switch off. And fuel selectors both off. Shutdown checklist complete. And I just had the weirdest moment because when I turned off the avionics switch, the ATC text feed disappears, but the YouTube live chat feed right next to it on my screen did not. And for some reason, only one of them disappearing seemed wrong. But that gets us to the end of our flight from Canberra to Newcastle. I hope you've enjoyed following along. It has been lovely having you in the chat. And to anyone who's catching up on this on the recording later, I hope you've also had fun. And we'll see by next stream if I decide to turn this into that theorised flight all the way around the Australian coast in stages, where it'll be an hour to an hour and a half flights each of just work out what the next airport along the coast is. But that gets us to the end of everything for today. I hope you've had fun. Thank you very much. I will see you next week.